Drying herbal plants and storing them for later use is an ancient tradition. There are a few pointers to keep in mind. You do not want to dry plants in the direct light, as light weakens their vitality and evaporates their volatile oils. So hanging them up isn't a good idea unless it's for decoration. Also, dust tends to accumulate on drying plants, which you don't want in your herbal teas. You want to dry your plants in temperatures of less than 90 degrees. Make sure you check the temperatures if you're using a dehydrator. You want to dry the plants, not cook them. It's very important to label your plants because dried herbs all look alike. Here in the Northeast, we are limited by our humid summers. The flow of air is really important to successful drying. An outside shed works well, or any place that's dry and has low humidity. Recently, I found that a hanging mesh herbal drying rack works well for drying plants. I hang it in a room that is usually warmer and drier in the summer. It's a very convenient way to dry plants. Just make sure you label the plants so you know what you have. I find the car is a great dehydrator. I figured this out by mistake after leaving my paper bags full of freshly gathered herbs in the car for several days. The herbs will dry very fast in a closed car environment, so sometimes it can be too hot. So check your bags often and leave the windows open slightly. You have to be very careful of the plants from the mint family, such as peppermint or lemon balm. They're sensitive to the heat and will turn dark. Drying larger amounts, you want to use a big paper bag and spread the herbs out in the bag. Don't leave them in a big bunch. Use several bags rather than squishing them all up in a single bag. Plants need air to dry. The car drying method works especially well for small amounts of leaves that you're harvesting on a weekly basis. Culinary herbs such as sage, basil, and thyme are probably the herbs I use this method with the most. I just give my herbal plants a haircut once in a while, and then at the end of the summer I have plenty of fresh dried herbs for cooking. Baskets work very well. I place the plants in a single layer inside shallow baskets and then cover them with another basket. Covering the baskets prevent light and dust from harming the herbs. The paper plate baskets that you used to buy at the picnic section work great. They stack well on top of each other. I like to dry calendula and chamomile flowers this way, along with smaller amounts of other herbal plants. I have a wonderful dehydrator that we built over 30 years ago. Unfortunately, they're no longer in business, but the plans for this dehydrator is in the book called Dry It, You'll Like It by Jen McManaman. If you can get a copy of this book, it's worth it. Now there's so many dehydrators on the market. Drying roots and berries is different. They take much longer to dry, and if they're not dried properly, they have a tendency to get moldy when stored. Place the roots on screens and put inside an airy room. When I had a wood stove, I would dry them near the stove, and I would place a sheet of newspaper over the drying roots to avoid the light and dust. Nowadays, I use baskets or I use my dehydrator to make sure they're really dry. Now that you've dried the plants, it's time to process them into smaller pieces so that you can store them properly away. This is known as garbling, which is a process of stripping the stems of their dried leaves and crumbling the dried leaves into a crushed form. It's easier to store herbs this way rather than storing the whole leaves. There's a couple of things to consider. The first helpful hint is to use clean leather gloves to garble the herbs that are itchy or sharp, such as nettles and mullein. It saves the hands. The most important factor is to make sure the plants are thoroughly dried before you put them away. You want to hear the snap sound, especially with the roots.
Yes, and that's why I really hate dull knives.
It is recommended that you slice the roots into small pieces before you dry them. It can be an arduous process, but it's worth taking the time. It is literally impossible to cut up most roots when they've dried. They're like pieces of stone. You need a hammer or a stone to break them up if you leave them whole. I like to cut up lemongrass into small pieces while it is still fresh because it's much harder to cut up when it dries. A fast way to strip dried leaves from their stems is to use a cooking rack placed over a tray. You just rub the dry herbs across the rack, the stems stay on top, and the leaves fall through the rack. It saves a lot of time. I also use it for dried elderberries. The next step is storing your dried herbs. The best way to store dried plants is in glass jars.